My stepdaughter introduced me as her mom's personal security at her wedding party. Her mom, my wife, laughed and said, "Of course, that's all he is." I smiled and calmly walked away. What happened next was rather unexpected. I will tell you everything. First, let me quickly thank you for your continuous support. This means a lot to us. If you enjoy the stories we share, kindly subscribe to this channel. It will be great if you can leave a comment on which city you are watching from. We might just give you a shout out in our next story. Today's special shout out goes to Tommy Bennett from New York. We are glad you enjoy our stories. Now let's go deeper into the story. When I married Helen, I knew I wasn't just marrying a woman, I was inheriting a history. She had a daughter, Layla, from a previous marriage, and they were close in that way only single mothers and their daughters can be symbiotic, sometimes conspiratorial, always tight-knit. I didn't expect to become anyone's father figure. I wasn't trying to replace her dad. I just wanted to be someone solid, steady. I came into their lives like a contractor fixing a roof, quiet, useful, and mostly out of sight. I paid bills before being asked, offered rides when Layla's car broke down, remembered birthdays when even her own mother forgot. And I did it all without a parade. That's just how I was raised. If you love someone, you carry the load when it gets heavy. You don't keep score. But over the years, I began to notice something. Being dependable made me invisible. At dinners, conversations would slide around me like I was a piece of furniture. Layla never introduced me to her friends beyond a vague, "my mom's husband." I wasn't included in family group chats or decisions. At first, I let it go. I told myself it didn't matter. I was older than Helen by 10 years, and maybe that made me easy to overlook in their faster, flashier world. I didn't need attention. But what I didn't realize was that invisibility isn't neutral, it's a kind of erasure. And when you've been erased long enough, the day someone draws a caricature of you in public, the laughter hits like a slap. That day came at Layla's wedding. It was a bright Saturday in June, one of those perfect days where the sky is offensively blue and everyone's skin glows with hope. I had helped plan most of it. Booked the venue, secured the catering deposit, paid the photographer in full. I didn't mind. It felt good to provide, to give Layla the day she dreamed of. I stood at the edge of the reception, watching guests dance and laugh. Helen looked radiant in her blue satin gown, and Layla was beaming in her lace dress. I was content to blend into the background, sipping sparkling water and making sure the DJ had everything he needed. That was my role, unseen logistics. Then, somewhere between the second round of toasts and the cake cutting, Layla waved me over. "Everyone, this is my mom's personal security," she said with a bright, jokey grin. Seriously, he's been guarding her for years. The guests laughed. Helen, standing next to her, added with a chuckle, "Of course, that's all he is." She didn't even look at me when she said it. My name wasn't mentioned. Not my stepdad, not Tom, just a label, a role, a prop. I smiled. That's all I did. I didn't let the corners of my mouth fall, didn't frown or flinch. I just smiled and walked away, weaving through the crowd like a ghost slipping through the walls. I left the party quietly, unnoticed. No one called after me. No one asked where I'd gone. I went home, poured myself a drink, and sat in the dark, watching the ice melt. The laughter from earlier echoed in my ears, louder now. Not because the joke was especially cruel, but because it was careless. It was the kind of joke you make when you've already decided someone doesn't matter. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in bed with Helen beside me, her breath steady and oblivious, while my mind replayed every moment I'd been the invisible man. Every time I said yes when I should have said nothing. Every time I paid when I should have paused. The love I gave wasn't transactional, but it damn sure wasn't disposable. And suddenly, I realized I wasn't angry because they made a joke. I was angry because they believed it. Deep down, they saw me as useful, not essential. Helpful, not human. That night, something inside me broke free, not with noise but with clarity. I wasn't going to be their background anymore. I woke up the next morning with the taste of silence in my mouth, bitter and cold like old coffee left out overnight. Helen was already up, humming to herself in the kitchen as if the previous night hadn't happened. As if her husband hadn't been dressed down like a hired bodyguard in front of 100 guests. I got dressed slowly, methodically. Every movement felt intentional. There was no rage pulsing in my veins, no dramatic outburst waiting to boil over. Just a clean, sharp understanding that the line had been crossed, and I was done letting people draw lines around me without my consent. Downstairs, Helen was making toast, the scent of burnt edges filling the room like a minor annoyance. She looked up and smiled. "Morning. Everything went so beautifully yesterday, didn't it?" Her eyes sparkled with satisfaction, like she expected me to nod and share in the glow of her daughter's perfect day. I stared at her, not with contempt, but with something deeper: recognition. This was a woman who had never once paused to consider that maybe her husband didn't want to be the silent benefactor anymore. That maybe her idea of partnership was dangerously one-sided. "It did," I said evenly, pouring myself a glass of water. She looked happy. Helen nodded, oblivious. "You were such a help. Layla told me you even got the florist to fix the arrangement last minute. Honestly, I don't know what we'd do without you." That sentence hung in the air for a beat longer than it should have. Not, "I don't know what we would do." No, it was what we do without you, as in, you're useful. As in, you're a tool. It didn't feel like gratitude. It felt like confirmation of what had been joked about last night. I was just the man who made things work. No name, no place, no real presence beyond my function. I sat down at the table, watched her spread jam like nothing had changed, and said, "By the way, I canceled the honeymoon bookings." The knife paused mid-stroke. She looked up slowly. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I called the travel agent this morning. Canceled the flights. Refunded the hotel and the excursions. The full package. Everything's been reversed." She blinked. "You're joking." "I'm not." The silence that followed was thick, so thick it pressed against my chest like a second skin. Her eyes narrowed, mouth slightly parted, as if trying to comprehend the foreign language I had just spoken. Helen had never seen this version of me. She was used to the quiet supporter, the steady hand. But that man had been retired. What sat before her now was a man who had just redrawn every boundary in ink. "You can't do that," she said, her voice sharp now. "Layla and Greg are supposed to leave tomorrow." I took a sip of water, then met her gaze. Then they should have thought twice before mocking the man who made those plans possible. "It was a joke, Tom. Don't be so sensitive." And there it was, the sentence that always comes after cruelty disguised as humor. I'd heard it too many times in different variations. "It's just a joke. You're overreacting. Don't take it personally." But see, the problem is, people only say that when they're punching down, when they know the person on the receiving end won't push back. What they call humor is often just cruelty with timing. And for years, I had laughed along with it, even when the joke was on me. "It wasn't a joke," I said slowly. "It was a message, one I received loud and clear." She stood, angry now. "You're punishing her for being a little flippant at her own wedding?" I stayed seated. "No. I'm holding her accountable for years of treating me like a glorified wallet, like her mother's errand boy, like someone who didn't deserve to be acknowledged by name in a room full of people I helped pay to feed." Helen's face flushed red. "This isn't like you." "You're right," I said. "It's not. But maybe it should have been." She stormed off then, phone in hand, probably to call Layla and tell her that the honeymoon was off. I didn't care. I had been many things to that girl. Chauffeur, event planner, financial backer, but one thing I had never been was respected. And I couldn't think of a better time to stop pretending that didn't matter. My generosity had become a given, not a gift. And the second I stepped outside of their expectations, suddenly I was the bad guy. The phone calls started within the hour. Layla's name lit up on my screen like a siren. I let it ring. Then Greg. Then Helen again. I finally picked up after the fourth attempt, bracing myself. "Tom," Layla said, her voice already pleading. "Mom said you canceled everything. Is this some kind of mix-up?" "No mix-up," I said flatly. "But we're leaving tomorrow. Greg already took off work. Everything's packed. I'm sure you'll figure it out." Her voice dropped into something more venomous. "Why would you do this? Over a joke?" I exhaled slowly. Because it wasn't just a joke. It was the last in a long line of reminders that you don't see me. Not really. I've been nothing but generous to you, and you couldn't even give me the courtesy of calling me by name at your own wedding. You chose to make me a punchline. Layla went quiet. I heard her inhale sharply. Then, almost childlike, "I didn't mean it that way." "I know," I said. That's the problem. And I hung up. The house was quiet again, but this time it wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of quiet that comes after an earthquake. When the dust settles and people crawl out from under the weight of their assumptions. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel cruel. I felt clear. Sometimes clarity is the sharpest form of peace. The funny thing about boundaries is that people only notice them when they're finally enforced. Before that, they just see blank space, permission, passivity, silence dressed up as agreement. But once you draw a line, even gently, even quietly, it feels like a war declaration to those who've been stepping over it for years. That morning, I hadn't raised my voice or slammed a door. I hadn't cursed or thrown accusations. I had simply withdrawn something I had offered freely. And you'd think I'd set the house on fire, the way they reacted. By noon, the phone calls had become relentless. Helen moved through the house like a storm cloud, slamming drawers, muttering under her breath, refusing to look me in the eye. She'd taken the bedroom phone into the bathroom for a 20-minute whisper session with Layla, punctuated by the occasional sharp, "I know," and "he's being ridiculous." I didn't bother listening in. I wasn't interested in defending myself in a court where the verdict had already been written. I had said what needed to be said. The rest was theirs to sit with. Then Greg showed up. He knocked like he lived there, 3 fast raps, followed by the doorbell. When I opened the door, he was wearing that tight-lipped, tight-jawed expression men wear when they're trying not to seem angry but are boiling just under the surface. He had on a crisp polo shirt and khakis, as if he'd dressed up for confrontation. "Hey," he said, hands in his pockets. "Can we talk?" I stepped aside and let him in. He walked straight into the living room, like he was on a mission, like maybe he thought showing up in person would rattle me into reversing the decision. I stayed by the doorway, arms folded. "I get that you're upset," he began, "and I just want to say, on behalf of both of us, that we're sorry if the joke came off wrong." "If," I said quietly. He winced a little. "I mean, we didn't mean any harm. Layla really appreciates everything you've done. We both do. I think maybe it was just the stress of the day, you know? People say things without thinking." "That's exactly the point," I replied. She didn't think. Because I'm not someone she's been taught to consider. Greg sighed and sat down on the edge of the couch like he was suddenly very tired. "Okay. Look, I get it. You're hurt. But canceling the honeymoon? I mean, come on. That's huge. We're supposed to leave tomorrow." "You still can," I said. "Just not on my dime." He rubbed his face. "We can't afford it right now, Tom. You know that." I leaned against the doorframe, letting the weight of that sentence settle. There it was again, that assumption that I was the fallback, the buffer, the safety net. The man who could be dismissed in one breath and depended on in the next. They had built a system around me, and it never once occurred to them that I might step away from the control panel. "I'm not responsible for fixing what disrespect broke," I said. Greg looked at me then, not with anger, but with something like dawning confusion. Maybe even respect. He opened his mouth, closed it, then finally stood. "Okay," he said. "I get it. It's your money. Your call." "It's not about the money," I said. "It's about being seen." And you two looked right past me. He nodded slowly, then walked out the door without another word. I didn't follow. I didn't feel smug or triumphant. What I felt was more complicated. Like someone who had finally said no after years of yes, and was still learning how to sit with the sound of his own refusal. That evening, Helen barely spoke to me. She reheated leftovers without asking if I was hungry, then ate in front of the TV with the volume too loud. I could feel her resentment pulsing off her in waves. And still, she didn't apologize. Not for the joke. Not for laughing. Not for anything. Her silence wasn't surrender. It was a silent protest, a punishment, a message that if I didn't resume my role, I'd be frozen out of the parts of the relationship that made it bearable. But I didn't break. I went up to our bedroom, closed the door, and lay on my back, staring at the ceiling. I thought about all the times I'd quietly paid for things, Layla's car repairs, her graduate school tuition deposit, even the down payment on the wedding venue. No one had asked. No one had said thank you. It had just been assumed. And I'd let it happen because I wanted to be good, helpful, needed. But the cost of that role had crept up on me, slowly draining something essential until I barely recognized the version of myself who had once believed love was supposed to mean sacrifice without end. That night, I pulled up the confirmation emails for the canceled trip and forwarded them to Helen, with no subject line and no message. Just proof that I meant what I said. And then, for the first time in years, I slept like a man who had nothing left to prove. Helen finally confronted me 2 days later, though confronted might be too strong a word for what actually happened. It was more of a performance, half indignation, half reluctant truce. She waited until I'd settled into the armchair with my coffee, as if calculating the most disarming moment. I knew she'd been speaking to Layla nonstop. Their voices murmured behind closed doors, behind the hum of bathroom fans, and the white noise of a home that was no longer neutral ground. When she appeared in the doorway, arms crossed, expression tight, I could already tell this wasn't about understanding. This was about getting things back to normal. That word had started to feel like a curse. "She's sorry, Tom," Helen said without preamble. "She's really sorry. And frankly, I don't think this punishment fits the crime." I didn't look up. I stirred my coffee, let the silence settle between us like ash. "It's not a punishment. It's a correction," Helen huffed. She was nervous. People say dumb things when they're nervous. It was her wedding day. "And what about you?" I asked, finally lifting my eyes to hers. "You joined in. You laughed." That stopped her. Not long, just a blink, a stutter in her posture. Then she rolled her eyes slightly, as if to say, "Are we really going to go there?" "I didn't mean anything by it," she said. "You know that." "I used to think I did," I said. "Now I'm not so sure." Her arms dropped to her sides, and for a brief second, something like vulnerability flickered across her face. She walked further into the room, sat on the edge of the couch, like she wasn't quite sure she was welcome. "I know you feel disrespected," she said, trying for softness. "And I'll admit, I should have stopped her. I should have corrected her on the spot. I didn't think it would matter that much to you. You've always been so steady." That word again. Steady. I wondered if they taught it in some secret manual. How to justify taking advantage of someone without feeling guilty. Chapter 1. Compliment his stability. Chapter 2. Frame your disrespect as his strength. "Helen," I said quietly, "do you even know what I do for you? For her? Have you ever stopped to really look?" She hesitated. "Of course I do." "No," I said. "You know what I give. But you don't see me. There's a difference." She looked at her hands, and for once, had nothing to say. I leaned forward. "I have carried the weight of this household for years, financially, emotionally, logistically, and I never complained. I didn't ask for parades, but I also didn't expect to be mocked in front of strangers. I didn't expect to be reduced to a bodyguard when I've done more for Layla than her own father ever did." Her head snapped up at that. "You're not her father. And that," I said, "has never been more obvious than it was that night." She flinched. Whether from guilt or defensiveness, I couldn't tell. Probably both. She stood abruptly, pacing. "So what now?" "You're cutting her off completely." "No," I said. "I'm cutting off the version of me that let you all believe I didn't have limits." She stopped pacing. "So what does that look like?" I shrugged. "Less giving. Less stepping in when you're both in over your heads. More distance. You can love people and still draw lines." Helen stared at me like she was seeing something, or someone she hadn't realized was there all along. Maybe that was true. Maybe she had married the idea of a husband who solved problems, and only now was meeting the man who had been buried under that role. "She wants to come by," Helen said after a beat. "She wants to apologize in person." "I'll listen," I said. "But I'm not interested in another, if you were offended, speech." Helen nodded and left the room. Not angry this time. Just quiet. Thoughtful. That was something. Layla came the next afternoon, wearing that expression adult children put on when they're trying to look innocent again. Like if they smile just right, they'll be 6 years old in your eyes instead of 30. She brought cookies. I didn't touch them. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, hands folded neatly, and started talking. "I've been thinking about what you said," she began. "And you're right. I've taken you for granted. I've seen you as the guy who makes things work. And maybe I leaned too hard into that. Maybe I forgot you were a person, not just a support system." I didn't speak. I wanted her to keep going, not because I needed more apologies, but because I needed to know this wasn't rehearsed. that it wasn't damage control. She continued, "When I called you security, I thought it was funny, but I didn't think about how it sounded. And then when Mom laughed, it felt like we were in on something, and you were outside of it. And I hated that feeling later." That last part sounded real. "I don't expect things to go back to how they were," she said, "but I want to earn your respect again." I nodded. That was enough for now. Not because she said the perfect words, but because for the first time, she wasn't defending herself. She was looking at me without expectation, just accountability. She left the cookies on the table. I still didn't eat them. That night, Helen reached for my hand in bed. I let her. We didn't speak, but her grip was tighter than usual, like she knew something had shifted, like she was holding on, not to me, but to the realization that I was no longer holding everything alone. I didn't announce the changes, I just began living them. Subtle at first. I stopped checking Layla's car registration reminders. I didn't refill the emergency envelope of cash Helen kept hidden in the kitchen drawer. I said no when asked to front the cost for a plumber after her friend's toddler flushed a toy down the guest toilet. These weren't punishments, they were recalibrations. I had trained everyone around me to believe I had no bottom, no line that said, enough. But I had one, and it was closer than they ever realized. The first time Helen really noticed, was a week later when her credit card bill came in and she didn't see the automatic payment processed. She asked me, half casually, like it was a small oversight, if I'd forgotten to pay it. I told her no, I hadn't forgotten. I'd just decided not to anymore. "You always pay it," she said, confusion tightening her voice. "I used to," I replied. "That was before." Her mouth opened, then closed. She stared at the envelope, then at me, like I'd spoken a language she didn't quite recognize. And maybe I had. Maybe no sounded foreign coming from my mouth. But the more I said it, the more fluent I became. And with each refusal, something strange happened. I felt lighter. Like every unnecessary responsibility I shed returned a little piece of me that I hadn't even known was missing. Layla didn't call as much after that. Not that she'd ever been the kind of daughter who checked in unless she needed something, but now the silence felt intentional. I suspected she was licking her wounds, regrouping, maybe even complaining to Greg about how cold I'd become. Let her. People don't like when you change the terms of a relationship they benefited from. That's not cruelty, it's math. You subtract the effort and the balance changes. You start charging interest on your time, and suddenly, they act like you're bankrupting them. Helen, to her credit, tried to adjust. She cooked more. She stopped leaving things on my desk with yellow post-its reading urgent. She asked before assuming, but I could feel the resentment simmering underneath. The quiet muttering when she thought I wasn't within earshot. The sighs. The slow withdrawal of affection, like she was bargaining with silence. For years, I had made it easy to love me because I asked for nothing. Now that I asked for respect, the love came with conditions. I started spending more time outside, walking, sitting at the park, driving to nowhere in particular just to breathe without being needed. There was a freedom in those small escapes, like I was reacquainting myself with the man I'd been before I volunteered as caretaker of a family that never fully made room for me. I remembered liking old jazz records, reading war memoirs, fixing things with my hands not because they were broken, but because I found peace in the process. I bought myself a new set of tools. Not because anything needed fixing, but because I did. One night, I came home later than usual. Helen was waiting at the table, wine glass in hand, the air thick with that heavy stillness that only shows up when someone's been rehearsing what they're about to say. "Are we okay?" she asked. I took off my jacket slowly, hung it up. "Define okay." She sighed. "You're different. This whole thing with Layla, it's changed you." "No," I said, sitting across from her. "It revealed me." She looked genuinely hurt. "You used to be so generous." "I still am," I said. "Just not with people who think generosity is owed." She blinked. "That's not fair." "It's not meant to be fair," I said. "It's meant to be honest." She sat back, glass cradled in both hands like a shield. "So what now? Are we just two strangers living in the same house?" "I hope not," I said. "But I'm not going back to who I was. That version of me disappeared the night you laughed." Her eyes welled, but she didn't cry. She's not a woman who cries easily, not even when things are breaking. That's something I used to admire about her, her strength. But now I saw it differently. Sometimes strength is just the ability to ignore the damage you're causing because it doesn't show up on your skin. We sat in silence for a long time after that. I didn't offer her comfort. She didn't reach across the table. It was the most honest moment we'd had in months. Later that week, a bill came in for Layla's honeymoon alternative, something last minute, something domestic and smaller. She had clearly scraped it together. The invoice was addressed to me, forwarded accidentally through a mutual contact who didn't realize the new rules. I folded it, placed it back in the envelope, and left it on the counter untouched. When Helen saw it, she didn't ask. She just walked past it, like a test she'd already failed. I wasn't trying to teach anyone a lesson. That's not what boundaries are. They're not discipline. They're dignity. And mine had been stretched too thin, too long. Now it had shape again. Wait. Presence. One evening, I booked a cabin for myself, a weekend away in the mountains. No fanfare, no announcement. I left a note on the fridge that read simply, "Gone hiking. Don't wait up." I took my books, my records, my new tools. And as I drove away, I felt no guilt. No fear that I'd be missed, needed, or judged. Only peace. Sometimes the biggest change doesn't come from confrontation, it comes from disengagement. I hadn't shouted. I hadn't demanded apologies. I'd simply stopped showing up in the ways they had come to expect. And in doing so, I finally showed up for myself. The cabin wasn't anything extravagant, just 2 small rooms tucked into the shoulder of a pine-covered hill. No television, no internet. Just the steady hush of wind brushing tree limbs, the occasional rustle of unseen animals, and the rhythmic creak of floorboards under my feet. It had been years since I'd been somewhere that quiet, where I wasn't listening for someone else's voice, responding to someone else's needs. The stillness didn't intimidate me. It comforted me. It reminded me that peace isn't found in distance from others. It's found in proximity to yourself. And I had been far from myself for far too long. I spent the first afternoon reading, then napping, then walking a path that curved around the edge of the woods. I didn't check my phone. I didn't wonder what Helen or Layla were doing. I didn't feel like a husband or a stepfather. I felt like a man who had survived something. And in a way, I had. Not a battle with violence or blood, but with erosion. A long, slow wearing away of my identity until only my usefulness remained. Coming out the other side wasn't marked by a grand victory. It was marked by stillness, by the realization that I didn't need to explain myself to be justified. I had been justified the moment I stopped tolerating disrespect. On the second day, I sat on the cabin porch with a cup of coffee and a small notebook. I started writing, not for anyone else, not as a letter or a warning, but for me. Just thoughts, pieces of the man I had buried beneath all the roles I'd taken on. I wrote about the first time Layla asked me for money. Years ago, when she was 23 and her credit card had been frozen. I hadn't even hesitated. I wrote about the way Helen had started assuming my help, like it was oxygen. I wrote about my silence at the wedding, that fake smile, the moment I walked out and nobody noticed. And with each sentence, I felt a little more like myself again. That evening, I grilled a small steak over the fire pit. I ate alone under the stars, no music, no talking. Just the crackle of the flames and the taste of something earned. I realized then that solitude doesn't always mean loneliness. Sometimes it means clarity. Sometimes it's the only place where you can hear your own voice again, after years of it being drowned out. When I returned home 2 days later, nothing dramatic had shifted on the surface. The house still smelled like lavender detergent. The couch pillows were fluffed the same way Helen always arranged them. But something invisible had changed. Helen looked up from her tablet when I walked in. She didn't say, "Where were you?" or "Why didn't you call?" She just studied my face for a long moment, then said, "You look rested." "I am," I said. She nodded slowly. There was a sadness in her eyes, but also something else. Respect, maybe, or resignation. Either way, she didn't push. She just let me be. That was new. Layla didn't reach out. Not in the first week, not in the second. I figured she was waiting, testing the waters to see if I'd revert to the man I'd been. But I didn't. I paid my own bills. I kept my own calendar. I let them find their way without leaning on me like a crutch they never acknowledged. A month later, I got a card in the mail. No return address, just a plain white envelope with my name in blue ink. Inside, a simple message. Thank you for everything. I'm sorry it took me this long to see you. It wasn't signed, but I knew who it was from. It was the first time Layla had written to me. Not texted, not emailed, but actually sat down with pen and paper. It didn't fix everything, but it was something. I didn't write back. That's the thing about boundaries. They're not fences to keep people out. They're mirrors. They show you who values you when you're no longer performing for them. They show you who stays when the perks are gone. Helen and I stayed together, though our dynamic changed. We spoke more carefully. She stopped assuming. I stopped volunteering. We became something quieter, more mutual. Maybe even more honest. Love doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just learns how to ask instead of expect. Months passed. Then one evening, we were invited to a family event, Layla's birthday dinner. I went. I didn't offer to pay. I didn't bring a gift that cost hundreds. I brought a card and a small leather-bound notebook with her initials engraved. Something thoughtful. Something simple. When she opened it, she looked at me, her eyes soft. "Thank you," she said, and she said it like she meant it. Later, as people laughed around the table and the candles burned low, someone asked Layla to introduce the people sitting closest to her. She went around, her friends, her cousin, her mother. Then she looked at me. "And that's Tom," she said, voice steady. "My mom's husband, and one of the most quietly important people in my life." No jokes, no laughs, just that. I nodded. That was enough. On the way home, Helen reached for my hand. She didn't say anything. She just held it like it meant something. And for the first time in a long time, it did. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt overlooked, taken for granted, or finally found the strength to draw the line, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more emotionally raw, real-life narratives that dig deep into family dynamics and personal transformation. See you soon in the next story.